Welcome, friend. Settle into a comfortable position. Let your body sink into the softness around you and allow the world to quiet down. In tonight's gentle journey into the past, we explore a figure shrouded in armor and legend, the medieval knight. But instead of swordplay or gallant quests, we'll focus on the quiet truths beneath the clinking metal, the constant struggle, the daily wear, the burdens of loyalty, and the silence behind the visor. Knighthood is often remembered in shining images, banners fluttering against blue skies. Yet behind this picture lies a rhythm of life built on duty, discomfort, debt, and deeply structured routines. Together, we'll gently walk through this world in 4 quiet chapters, each one peeling back a layer of myth to reveal something quieter, perhaps more human. So, if you're ready, we begin not on a battlefield, but in the muddy yard of a manor, where a knight's day begins in silence. And don't forget to like and subscribe, so we have more motivation to produce better quality products. Let's go with the rhythm of their days. Chapter 1. Armor, oaths, and endless mud, a day in a knight's life. Imagine yourself waking before dawn. The cold stones beneath your feet are still holding the chill of night. Outside, the first gray mist curls over the bare fields. You are not yet in armor. That will come later. But already, the day begins with movement. There is no real luxury, even for a knight. Your boots are heavy with last night's rain. You nod to the stable hands, their hands red with cold, as they saddle your warhorse. It's not all gallops and tournaments. Most days are full of stillness and slow repetition, drills, inspections, and the constant maintenance of your weapons, your armor, your obligations. Let us pause here for a moment and consider the armor itself. What may seem glorious from afar, the polished steel, the impressive silhouette, is in truth burdensome. A full suit of plate armor, which became widespread in the late Middle Ages, could weigh anywhere between 45 to 55 pounds. While designed with some balance in mind to allow flexibility and movement, its weight was not evenly distributed across the body. The shoulders and hips bore much of the burden. Over time, even trained muscles fatigued, and that fatigue became part of daily life. When donning armor, a knight required assistance. A squire, or sometimes multiple squires, will methodically strap, buckle, and secure each piece. Cuirass, vambraces, greaves, gauntlets. It was not a process to be rushed. And once inside the shell of steel, the world changed. Sound became muffled. Peripheral vision narrowed. The air grew close, especially beneath a helmet, where breath rebounded and heat gathered. On a summer day, heat could rise dangerously beneath the metal. Sweating in armor led to dehydration, dizziness, and in some cases, collapse. On cold days, the armor turned brittle and stiff, and it was never worn alone. Beneath the metal, knights wore padded garments called arming doublets or gambesons, which absorbed from the shock, but added layers of heat and weight. Then came the matter of movement. It is a myth that knights were clumsy or immobilized by their armor. Well-fitted suits allowed surprisingly agile movement, but that agility came at a cost. Every motion, lifting a sword, raising a shield, mounting a horse, demanded more energy than doing so unarmored. Even kneeling to pray or bow took effort. It was not only the weight, but the tension. The straps dug into the body, especially after hours of wear. The padding underneath grew damp and heavy with sweat. A long march in armor was a trial of endurance, and knights who traveled far from home often did so with aching joints, stiff necks, and shoulders rubbed raw. In the saddle, armor shifted, pressed, and pinched. One did not simply ride. It was an exercise in discomfort and constant adjustment. And yet, every piece had to be perfectly fitted and properly layered. Ill-fitting armor was a death sentence. A gap near the neck, a misaligned pauldron, or a weak fastening could turn even the best knight into an easy target. Knights took their measurements seriously, and armorers were respected craftsmen whose skills meant the difference between life and death. Some knights carried small tools with them to make emergency repairs. Armor also became a symbol of rank and wealth. Ornate etchings, crests, and gilded details spoke of lineage and standing. But beauty didn't always match function. Some ceremonial armor was heavy and impractical in battle. A knight might wear simpler, more functional gear in combat, reserving decorative suits for tournaments or state appearances. After long days, the removal of armor was almost ritualistic. The squire would help lift off each piece, and the knight's body would be marked with the day's strain, red welts, sore muscles, and sometimes shallow cuts from sparring. Cleaning the armor was not just a chore, but a necessity. Steel exposed to sweat, and weather could rust overnight. The smell of oil and metal lingered in every knight's quarters. Imagine now the slow rhythm of polishing. A cloth drawn again and again over curved steel. The quiet concentration. The careful attention to each joint and plate. The scraping away of dirt and dried mud. In the background, the low murmur of voices, the creaking of wooden beams, and the soft snort of horses in the stable yard. And then there were the seasons to consider. In winter, armor grew unbearably cold, biting through woolen layers beneath. In summer, it became a furnace. Some knights fainted in the heat of the sun, not from wounds, but from exhaustion and dehydration beneath their metal skin. And yet they returned to it daily. To be a knight was not to play at war. It was to live inside the tools of it. To become so accustomed to discomfort that one hardly noticed weight anymore, even when it was breaking him down. Even while seated at a feast, a knight's thoughts might return to his armor. Was the strap near the elbow starting to fray? Had the breastplate been buffed properly after that last training match? Would the rivets hold during the next tilt? This mental weight was as significant as the physical. To be unarmored in the wrong place or at the wrong time could mean vulnerability. And so, even in moments of peace, a knight's relationship with his armor persisted. In memory, in anticipation, in a quiet checklist that never fully stopped ticking. Some knights developed lifelong injuries from their equipment. Compressed vertebrae, early arthritis, persistent bruising on hips and shoulders. But these ailments were seldom discussed. Pain was part of the fabric of knighthood. It was folded into every motion, every duty, every dawn. And yet, for all its burden, the armor remained. It had to. Without it, a knight was just a man with a sword. With it, he was seen, by his peers, by his lore, by those beneath him, as something more. So you see, the armor was not just a tool. It was identity, status, constraint, shield and weight. And at the close of the day, as the knight lies down on straw or board, letting the aches settle into his bones, the armor does not disappear. It rests nearby. It waits. Tomorrow, once more, it will be lifted, fastened, and worn. The same straps pulled tight. The same breath drawn within the helm. The same weight upon his back. Not for glory, not for legend, simply because that was what it meant to live as a knight. And in that quiet truth, we find not fantasy, but the gentle, persistent rhythm of a life lived under iron. Silence became a training partner. There were no cheers on the practice fields, no applause when the blade met the dummy with just the right force. The rewards were invisible, a more fluid movement, a quicker parry, a steadier hand. These gains were slow, incremental, and deeply personal. Some knights recited prayers between drills, not out of ritual alone, but as a means of centering themselves. Faith and fitness became interwoven. Disciplines of body paired with those of the soul. Others sang quietly, simple chants to keep time or distract from fatigue. And though knights often trained alone or with squires, they were rarely solitary. Training was a communal act. Lessons were shared. Wisdom passed from one generation to the next through gesture, correction, and example. In this way, a knight's lineage was not just blood, but form and practice. When training for real battle, knights might even reenact scenarios. Mock ambushes in wooded groves, horseback pursuits across open hills, the defense of a gate or breach. These were not games, but serious rehearsals. They taught timing awareness and trust in one's comrades. Fatigue was constant. Sleep came easily, but never quite restored everything. Calluses hardened. Muscles remembered. Over time, even the most demanding routines became familiar. The body adjusted. The mind accepted. There were days when injuries halted progress. A twisted ankle, a strained shoulder, a cracked rib from a misplaced blow. In those times, the knight observed, learned through watching, returned slower but wiser, And what are the failures? There were many failed strikes, slips from the saddle, bruises too numerous to count. Yet failure was part of the ritual. It was not feared, it was folded into the process. This was a long, slow shaping of a knight, a sculpting of will as much as body, not for glory, not for applause, but because the rhythm demanded it. So now, with his rhythm in our ears, the soft swish of training tunics, the steady thud of wooden swords, the quiet breath of exertion, we turn our gaze toward one who embodied this discipline beyond all measure. And still it continued. For some knights, training didn't stop even as they aged. Older knights might scale back their sparring, but they continued to walk the grounds, offering guidance, critiquing form, or practicing slow movements that kept their joints from stiffening. In this way, the training ground became places of mentorship as much as labor. Knights who had once trained beneath towering men in creaking armor now passed on their own subtle corrections. A twist of the wrist to deflect a blow more cleanly, a shorter stance to hold the center of gravity. Advice spoken in soft tones between breaths, between strikes. They also trained for endurance, not in sprints or sudden bursts, but long sessions of sustained movement, holding shields for hours, pacing while armored, climbing inclines while weighed down. These slow trials shaped not only muscle, but resolve. And then, too, was a practice of restraint. Knowing not when to strike, but when not to. Training involved learning how to walk away, how to carry composure even in the face of challenge. This self-control became a mark of a seasoned knight, one who knew the cost of unnecessary conflict. Mental rehearsals were part of the process as well. Knights were expected to visualize combat before it occurred, to run through forms, responses, and choices in the quiet of early morning or late evening. Even as they sat by the fire or walked the perimeter of a keep, their minds returned to drills, imagined patterns, practiced reflexes. The knight became not just trained, but trained to train. He became a self-renewing force of habit and precision. And that mindset of discipline without end, of readiness shaped through fatigue, was what defined his world. There is comfort in repetition. Even hardship, done predictably, can offer peace. And the knight, bound by seasons, obligations, and long hours under gray skies, learned to find steadiness within the structure. And now, with the smell of earth still in the air and the echoes of wooden blades fading from the fields, we turn to one who bore the full weight of these habits with rare grace. And still, even the most dedicated training was never enough to guarantee safety. That, too, was part of the unspoken lesson. No amount of drilling could assure victory, nor could physical prowess alone overcome bad luck, shifting alliances, or the surprise of an enemy's cunning. A knight trained to control what he could, knowing full well that much remained outside his grasp. Some trained to forget, losing themselves in the repetition of motion, the rhythm of breath and steel. Others trained to remember, carrying the memory of fallen comrades in every strike, every block, every careful move on the field. To train was not just to prepare for war, but to make peace with its likelihood. And in the quietest corners of the training yard, there were moments of stillness. The pause before a sparring match began, the hush between exercises, the gentle rustle of leaves overhead as two tired knights shared water and silence. These were the unnoticed parts of knighthood, the unseen bonds that formed without words. Even a knight's dreams were shaped by training. In sleep, the body remembered drills, the mind rehearsed movements. It was not uncommon for knights to wake with a jerk of the hand, as if blocking a blow in a dream. The muscle memory extended beyond daylight. And so, knighthood was not a title given and forgotten. It was a practice, daily, lifelong, consuming. One did not finish training. One only lived further into it. With this deeper understanding, we now move onward. Not a sword or shield, but to one man who embodied this quiet discipline for decades. Before we turn to him, though, let us consider another layer of the knight's reality. The knight spent far from the manor's hearth, the cold fields, the damp tents, and the grinding discomfort of life on the move. For when the time came to serve his lord beyond the estate walls, the knight entered a new realm of hardship. Campaigning was no romantic endeavor. It meant long rides across unfamiliar territory, often with little sleep, stale rations, and aching limbs. Armored and alert, knights moved with their retinues, Dozens of men and animals in a slow, rumbling column across muddy roads and rain-slicked passes. Every morning meant saddling in haste, and every evening brought no promise of warmth. Tents, when available, were canvas and prone to leaking. More often, a knight might sleep under a tree or beneath his horse blanket. His bed was the ground, damp, uneven, sometimes frozen. His pillow, a saddle or bundle of cloaks. The sounds of the night were not crickets and wind, but the low groans of horses, the coughs of men, and the ever-present creak of armor being shifted for comfort. Food was a challenge. Salted meat, hard bread, cheese, if it had not spoiled, was the usual fare. Water was drawn from rivers, often murky, or from wells of questionable depth. Wine, diluted and sour, was prized more for its safety than its taste. Fresh fruit or vegetables were rare luxuries. There was little privacy. Armor removed in haste had to be kept close. Weapons never left a knight's reach. Washing was done in streams, sometimes not at all. Mud clung to every surface, boots, tunics, hair. The scent of unwashed bodies and horses filled the air. It was not offensive, but constant part of the fabric of campaigning life. Weather shaped everything. Rain turned roads to mire and tents to sieves. Heat brought dust and thirst. Snow made every movement heavier. Cloaks froze stiff overnight. Gloves, once dampened, refused to dry. Feet blistered, boots split, and fingers grew numb in the chill. And yet the knight endured it, because he must. To complain was to dishonor. To falter was to bring shame. So he pressed on, brushing dew from his cloak each morning, scraping mud from his greaves, buckling his armor with practiced hands while steam rose from his breath. And all the while, he trained still. On the road, in the field, beside a campfire, he swung his sword. He drilled with squires. He watched the ground for signs of ambush. The campaign did not pause his discipline. It demanded more of it. And yet, these grueling campaigns were bound by more than exhaustion. They were framed by a deeper responsibility, one forged not in battle, but in solemn halls and candlelit chambers. The knight did not travel of his own free will. He moved because he had sworn to do so. Bound by oaths of fealty, he answered the summons of his lord without hesitation. Whether he agreed with the cause or understood the strategy mattered little. His word had been given. Oaths of loyalty were sacred. They were not penned lightly nor spoken with flair. They were often exchanged in the quiet presence of clergy, under the watchful eyes of witnesses, and sealed with gestures of submission, a kneeling posture, hands clasped between those of the liege. These moments marked the beginning of lifelong obligations. Once sworn, a knight could be called at any time. Days of rest or planting or festivity were all subject to interruption. The call to serve came not in glory, but in expectation. And so he rose, packed his armor, kissed his family farewell, and rode out again and again. Fealty was a ladder. The knight gave his service to a baron, who gave his to a duke, who answered to the king. Each link in the chain depended on the one below, and the knight stood as a foundation of this order. He could not shirk, and if he failed, the entire structure trembled. The oaths extended beyond combat. A knight might be called to guard a bridge, escort a noblewoman, oversee a border village, or enforce a lord's decree. These tasks, though less glamorous in battle, were essential and often more grueling. Long days of travel, difficult terrain, uncertain weather, delicate politics. The knight navigated all of it with sword at side and silence on his lips. And what did he receive in return? Sometimes land, sometimes favor, but often only the continuation of obligation. His freedom was not his own. He lived in service to another's cause, and his reputation rose or fell not on his choices, but on his ability to carry out the will of his lord. This is what lay behind the knight's every step across the campaign trail. The oath, unseen but unyielding, the invisible thread that pulled him forward, through mud, through fatigue, through cold winds and sleepless nights. But this oath, the knight's solemn promise of loyalty, was not simply a transaction. It was a bond of spirit as much as duty. It wove itself in the fabric of a knight's identity, shaping not just what he did, but how he saw himself. To break it was unthinkable. To question it, rare, The language of oaths was formal, but its meaning ran deeper, sworn upon relics or in sacred spaces, often accompanied by gestures of humility. Kneeling, bowed heads, offered swords. It carried a weight far beyond legalism. It was tied to one soul, seen as binding not only in life, but in judgment beyond. And so, even in quiet moments, while watching the dawn from the edge of a camp, or staring into the embers of a cook fire, the knight might recall his pledge. Not out of fear, but out of habit. It was always there, a whisper at the edge of thought. These oaths created a silent map of relationships. They placed the knight within a network of duty that stretched across counties, across kingdoms. His actions reflected on his lord. His lord's name echoed through his own. In this way, the knight was never alone. He was part of a living structure, fluid, tense, unshakable. There were rare moments when a knight might be forced to choose between competing oaths, when loyalty to one lord conflicted with service to another. In these moments, knights often turned to prayer, to counsel, to silence. There was no easy path, only the hope of honor. And so, we see that fealty was not simply a medieval contract. It was a quiet core of knightly life, a soft but unrelenting call to show up, to obey, to serve. Day after day, ride after ride, through celebration, through hardship, and through long winters when the roads were rutted with ice and no songs were sung. This was the real weight of knighthood, not the sword, not the armor, but the word given and never taken back. Before we turn fully to his story, let's reflect on one final reality, often hidden but constant. The crushing cost of knighthood, not just in sweat or blood, but in coin. It may come as a surprise, but many knights paid dearly to maintain the very image we remember them by. That shining armor? It was not a gift. That proud warhorse? It did not appear for free. Everything, every buckle, every sharpened edge, every flag stitched with a family crest, came at a price. Knighthood, in many ways, was a financial burden carried on broad shoulders. A full suit of armor, carefully crafted to fit a single body, could cost a small fortune, often more than a peasant would earn in a decade. Chainmail alone took months to produce. Plate armor, emerging in later centuries, demanded skilled smiths, specialized tools, and countless hours of labor. The result was a masterpiece, but one that came with a weighty bill. Beyond the armor, there was the matter of the horse. A destrier, trained for war, was not a common mount. These animals were strong, responsive, and often dangerous in unskilled hands. They were bred, selected, and trained for years, and their upkeep was constant. Grain, stabling, tack, shoes, grooms, each added another tally to the knight's ledger. And then came the weapons. A sword was not a simple iron bar. It was forged, balanced, honed, and decorated. Knights might carry multiple blades, long sword, arming sword, dagger, sometimes even a mace or axe. Each had to be maintained, cleaned, sharpened, and sometimes replaced. Helmets cracked in tournaments. Lances splintered in training. Shields were down under blows. Everything a knight carried was subject to wear, and everything needed replacing. These were not ornamental tools. They were used, and used hard. On top of this were the garments and gear worn beneath the armor. Padded tunics, chainmail coifs, boots, gloves, belts, and clasps. Many of these were made to order. The garments had to be soft enough to protect the skin, strong enough to endure the pressure of plate, and light enough to allow movement. And finally, the retinue. Few knights traveled alone. A squire or two, a page, perhaps a man-at-arms. All required food, clothing, and housing. Some knights employed armorers or fletchers. The more a knight could afford, the more he was expected to bring to war. A poor knight could barely outfit himself. A wealthy one brought banners. Banners brought attention, and attention brought responsibility. It was not uncommon for knights to go into debt to maintain appearances. Loans were taken. Land was mortgaged. Dowries were negotiated not only for alliance, but to cover the cost of armor and horses. The trappings of honor weighed heavy on the purse. And yet, to appear poor was to appear weak. A knight who failed to maintain his image risked being overlooked for favors, passed over for commands, or quietly excluded from the halls of power. So the knight paid, not just with sweat, not just with silence, but with silver. And now, having seen the full cost of the role, bodily, spiritual, and financial, we are finally ready to meet the man who bore it longer than most, one whose loyalty was not loud, but lasting. So now, with this landscape in mind, the heavy clouds, the soaked tunics, the hoofbeats echoing through the hills, we are ready to meet one who carried these burdens farther and longer than most. In the next breath, we'll follow this knight further, not into battle, but into the quiet loyalties and rare strength of one who endured them all, William Marshall. Chapter 2, William Marshall, the quiet loyalty of a medieval legend. But let us linger just a little longer on that early phase, those quiet years of waiting, of preparation, of being overlooked. Imagine yourself not as a mighty knight, but as a young boy, perhaps no older than 7, placed under guard in a cold, stony tower, not as punishment, but as political leverage. You know little of strategy, little of rebellion. You only know that your father has not surrendered the castle, and that your life hangs in the balance. You are a bargaining chip, a name on parchment, a heartbeat in a dangerous game. This is how William Marshall's life began. And when you are returned, spared for reasons no one fully explains, there is no triumph. There is only silence. You live, and that, in the Middle Ages, is often the greatest fortune of all. From there, your world narrows again. You are sent away, across the sea, to a noble household not your own. Normandy, green and windswept, becomes your new home. The mornings begin in darkness. Before sunrise, you are awake. You fetch water. You sweep the stone floor. You clean the hooves of horses not yours. You polish the armor of a knight who barely speaks your name. Day by day, you vanish into routine so strict, so silent, they feel eternal. Training is not glamorous. Your fingers blister from sword hilts. Your shoulders ache from hours on horseback. You learn not only to ride, but to ride with grace, to fall without shame, to bow, to kneel, to never speak before speaking loudly. You watch others, always watch, and when you are alone, you imitate their moves, not because you were told to, but because you have to, because you have nothing else. For years, this is your life. There are no awards, there are no songs, but slowly, something grows, a quiet confidence. You begin to anticipate your master's needs. You respond to a nod before it is given. You understand the rhythm of a feast, the weight of silence at court. And then one day, in an almost unnoticed moment, you were knighted. You do not feel ready. Most don't. But now you must carry not just a sword, but the weight of your own expectations. Still landless, still nameless in the grand scheme, but knighted nonetheless. What follows is another kind of training, the brutal, unpredictable school of tournaments. These are not the elegant just as storybooks, but vast, chaotic melees where dozens, sometimes hundreds, of men crash into one another across open fields. The goal is not just glory, but ransom. Capturing a knight means demanding payment. It is dangerous, exhausting, and fiercely competitive. In a world ruled by inheritance and bloodline, William Marshall's life began without promise. As a fourth son in a time when the firstborn received almost everything, William was destined for obscurity. He had no lands, no titles, and no expectations placed upon him, except perhaps survival. And even that, in his earliest days, was precarious. As a young boy, he was offered as a hostage by his father during a violent political dispute with King Stephen. This was not symbolic. It was life-threatening. The young William was placed directly in harm's way, held as assurance that his father would surrender a castle. His father, known for his shrewd and sometimes ruthless character, refused. And so William's life hung by a thread, at the mercy of the enemy. Yet, through chance or mercy, William survived. He was not executed. He was not maimed. He was returned. This early brush with death could have ended him, but instead it marked a quiet beginning. Sent away to train in Normandy in the household of William of Tancarville, William Marshall began his transformation, not into nobility by birthright, but nobility by conduct. There, he trained as a page and later as a squire, learning the slow, deliberate rituals of service. He learned to rise before dawn, to clean and maintain his lord's armor, to wait silently behind during important feasts, to manage the temper of a warhorse, and to fall into sleep with aching limbs beside the stable. The training was long and largely thankless. There were no rewards for effort, only discipline. William spent years immersed in the quiet duties of subservience, learning how to carry responsibility without recognition. He developed the quiet endurance of someone with no shortcut to glory, someone who had to earn each step forward. By the time he was knighted, it was not with spectacle. There was no great parade, no romantic ceremony with flowing banners and noble lords in attendance. It was simple, a sword across the shoulders, a solemn oath, and the knowledge that his life had irrevocably changed. Now, he carried his own armor. Now, he stood on his own, but still, no land awaited him. No inheritance softened the weight of that responsibility. What followed was not an immediate rise to fame, but slow work. First as a landless knight, a household retainer, then a competitor in tournaments. The tournaments of William's youth were not pageants. They were organized chaos, multi-day melees in vast fields, with alliances formed and broken mid-charge, with the bruises of battle and the occasional snap lance causing more injury than glory. William entered them not for show, but for survival. Through skillful riding and measured combat, he began to win, not only in victory, but in reputation. He took prisoners and ransoms, accumulated modest wealth, and most importantly, earned the cautious trust of powerful nobles. They saw in him something rare, not only a fighter, but a thinker, someone who didn't charge blindly but waited for the right moment, someone who placed duty above spectacle. His service under Henry the Young King, a prince known for splendor more than substance, was a proving ground. As the prince's tutor and companion, William remained loyal even as rebellion stirred around them. When the young king died, it was William who remained at his side. It was William who ensured his burial, who carried out his final wishes, and who received little for it, but the deeper kind of recognition, the kind that whispers through court halls and earns nods behind closed doors. That loyalty opened the door to a new chapter. He was rewarded, slowly, a marriage to Isabel de Clare, a wealthy heiress, lands in Leinster, a position of real authority. Yet none of it came quickly, and none of it was unearned. It was built from decades of obedience, silence, skill, and an extraordinary ability to wait without bitterness. His story is remarkable not for how loudly it was told, but for how long it unfolded in near silence. His ascent was a quiet climb, rung by rung, without a birthright to buoy him. In the medieval world, a world built on hierarchy and entitlement, his rise remains one of the clearest examples of earned nobility. And still, despite his status, William remained humble. He understood that the path to greatness was not paved in gold, but in grit. He was a figure shaped not by dramatic triumphs, but by steady choices. Where others sought renown, William sought continuity. Where others made noise, William made progress. In courts filled with whispering ambition and shifting loyalties, he was a quiet constant. Lords and kings began to value that rare steadiness, the kind of presence that didn't dominate a room but steadied it. This kind of influence was subtle. It didn't come from declarations or war cries, but from consistency. When others panicked, William advised. When others flattered, he observed. When others plotted, he remained. It was this stillness, this calm amid turmoil, that ultimately elevated him to England's highest trusts. In his later years, as Marshal of England and regent for the young Henry III, William wielded more power than most could dream. And yet, even then, he lived without extravagance. He gave generously to religious houses. He fulfilled the oaths of his youth. He never forgot the years when he served in silence. When he died, he asked to be buried not as a nobleman, but as a Templar, humble, austere, and simple. It was not the monument that mattered, but the path that led to it. William Marshall's rise is not the tale of a man who took power. It is a story of one who earned it quietly, patiently, and completely. A slow, steady climb from a forgotten hostage to protector of a kingdom. Now, let's continue gently, turning to the tournaments where reputation was carved from bruises and wisdom, where William did not rush into glory, but weighed every step like a chess piece on a field of iron and splinters. If the slow climb of William Marshall's career teaches us anything, it is that patience can be sharper than a sword. But there was another arena in which he earned his renown, one of wildness, glory, and peril. The medieval tournament. Tournaments, to modern ears, may conjure scenes of choreographed justs, elegant fanfare, and romantic declarations. But the tournaments of the 12th century were closer to organized chaos. These were sprawling multi-day melees where dozens, even hundreds, of knights would clash on foot and horseback. There were few rules. Alliances were made and broken mid-battle. Men were unhorsed and trampled. Sometimes they were killed. It was in these swirling battles of confusion and strategy that William Marshall rose to fame. Not because he charged recklessly, but because he calculated each move like a seasoned general. He was not driven by spectacle. He was driven by survival, by opportunity, and by the unspoken rules of his time. If you cannot inherit, then you must earn. Imagine the clamor of metal. The field is churned to mud by hooves. You are mounted, lance in hand, visor down. All around you is movement. Blazoned shields, glinting helms, the sound of distant trumpets, the neighing of horses. And within it all, William remains composed. He does not gallop blindly into the fray. He watches. He waits. He learns the rhythm of his opponent's charge. And when he strikes, it is not with wasteful bravado. It is with intention. Time and again, he emerged victorious, not by sheer force, but by tactical mastery. He took prisoners, which brought ransom. Ransom brought wealth, and wealth brought a reputation that outlasted bruises. He learned to read opponents by the twitch of their horses, the angle of their lance, or the way they leaned in the saddle. He knew the difference between bluster and true danger, between the knight who shouted before striking and the one who rode silently with deadly purpose. William's name began to echo through courts and camps alike. He became a man worth watching, worth betting on. He did not waste his fortune on silks or feasts, but invested in better steeds, stronger arms, and the quiet favor of noble patrons who value precision over pretense. And yet, even as the winnings piled and fame followed, he did not grow careless. He did not become one of those knights who chased tournaments across Europe, drunk on applause and blinded by vanity. He did not hunger for applause. He listened for silence, the quiet nod of respect from a rival, the private invitation to serve in a noble house. William understood something essential, that glory fades, and bruises do not. The same crowds that cheer a hero today may forget him tomorrow. So he chose a different path, one of restraint. Eventually, he stepped away from the melee, not because he was forced to, but because he knew he had proven enough. His final tournament victories were not dramatic exits, but quiet acknowledgments. I have earned what I need. That ability to walk away, while still victorious, is rare. It is a form of wisdom not taught in swordplay. It speaks to the discipline beneath the armor, the kind of inner compass that guided William not just in the lists, but in the courtrooms and council chambers that would follow. And so, let's imagine him now, not on the battlefield, but resting in a simple tent after one of his final tournaments. The dusk settles. The sounds of the field have faded. His armor lies beside him, dusty and worn. A squire tends to the horse. A distant fire crackles. And William, quiet, thoughtful, knows that his battles have earned him more than coin. They've earned him the trust of kings. In truth, Marshall's skill in the tournament field was not merely a performance. It was a calculated investment. In each competition, his real aim was never spectacle, but leverage. The ransom from captured knights bought him horses, land, and respect. But more than material gain, each tournament victory chipped away at the rigid barriers of class and inheritance. He could not claim his father's wealth, but with each win, he carved out a legacy of his own. There's a subtle dignity in knowing when to leave, not out of defeat, but from the quiet realization that you have already achieved what others spend lifetimes chasing. That was William Marshall's way, to fight with intensity, but to retreat with grace. He never overstayed his moment. He never confused applause with value. His journey was never about impressing the crowd. It was about building something unshakable beneath the noise. So as we sit here tonight, imagining the dust settling on the grassy fields of France or England, let us picture William not in the heat of battle, but in its gentle aftermath. A man who rode hard, who studied harder, and who, in the quiet spaces between tournaments, built the foundations of a legacy that would outlive the clang of steel and the cries of the crowd. The tent is quiet now. The stars have risen. Somewhere, a tournament banner flaps gently in the wind. And William Marshall, the master of restraint, rests in the knowledge that his worth was never in how many looked upon him, but in how well he carried himself when they no longer did. But let's return once more, just briefly, to the edge of that bustling tournament field, and stretch the image even further. The rhythm of hooves and shouting fades to a dull hum, and the dust stirs low in the twilight. What remains of the quiet calculations that happened not just on the field, but long before it? William did not merely ride out for glory. He studied the terrain. He observed patterns. He understood the value of timing, of fatigue, of the sun's angle in a warrior's eye. His squire, more than just a boy with armor, became a trusted aide. His horses were not randomly chosen. They were tested, trained, and matched the rhythm of his style. Even his injuries were carefully weighed. Was a bruised rib worth the prize purse? Was the lance wound worth the political connection? These are not the considerations of a reckless knight. They are the marks of a tactician in steel. What many saw as instinct was in fact preparation. William practiced daily, not just with a sword, but with restraint. He developed techniques to throw opponents without killing them, because ransom required life. He wore specific colors not just for heraldry, but to signal confidence, authority, and even availability for service. He was not always the flashiest rider, but he was one of the last still upright. This calm endurance carried him into dozens, some say hundreds of tournaments. And still, when younger knights began to take his place in the lineup, he didn't lament the passing of glory. He welcomed it, for in their victories, he saw his legacy continuing. There are even tales, soft ones, of him offering advice to younger opponents. Whispers in the stables, small corrections in stance, a warning not to press a weary mount too far. This quiet mentorship speaks volumes. And then there's the evidence of what he chose to keep. Not trophies, not portraits, but land. Secure, modest estates. Rights to pasture and water. Connections with abbots and lords. A network built on stability, not spectacle. In time, even kings came to trust his judgment. Not because he won every duel, but because he understood when not to draw a sword. That is the heart of this story, really. Not that William Marshall was the greatest tournament champion of his age, though many would say he was, but that he knew when to put the lance down, when to accept enough, when to turn skill into stewardship. And so, as you rest now, listening to the soft breath of history and the hush of remember horses, know this. Sometimes, the most heroic act is knowing when to step away. William Marshall did. And in doing so, he stepped into something far rarer than fame. He stepped into quiet legacy. To serve one king faithfully in the medieval world was admirable. To serve 4 kings and survive was something else entirely. William Marshall's enduring loyalty was not the blind allegiance of a follower, but the measured, cautious navigation of a man who understood the dangerous art of staying indispensable through turbulent times. Imagine a royal court in the late 12th century. Banners sway above the high table. The fire crackles in the hearth, and beneath the polite tones of noble speech lies the constant hum of rivalry. Kings fell out with sons. Brothers conspired against one another. Alliances shifted like sand. And through it all, William remained steady. He began under Henry II, a shrewd and often ruthless monarch who admired competence and loyalty. Marshall served him dutifully, but it was not without conflict. When Henry's son, also named Henry, known as a young king, rebelled against his father, William was sent to serve the prince. A delicate position. The son of your master becomes your new liege, yet the father still watches. Marshall walked this tightrope with quiet dignity. He was loyal to the young king, not in rebellion, but as a guiding hand. He performed his duties faithfully, advised prudently, and accompanied the prince through tournaments and military engagements. And when the young prince died, still in his 20s, William kept a vow to carry his cross to the Holy Land. It was a personal act of devotion, one that would earn him not only spiritual merit, but widespread respect among the nobility, a gesture of honor that echoed louder than any battlefield victory. Upon return to England after his crusade, William aligned himself with Richard the Lionheart, the crusading king with fire in his veins and ambition across continents. Richard's reign was often spent far from England, leading campaigns in the Holy Land or managing his vast Angevin empire. In the king's absence, governance became a delicate operation. Factions bloomed in court. Loyalties shifted. Yet William stood calmly among the changing winds. He managed lands, advised on diplomacy, and when necessary, sheathed his sword in service to stability. His loyalty was not flashy, but it was observed. Richard trusted him. He knew that in William, he had a man who would not sell secrets, who would not incite rebellion, who did not desire more than what was fair and earned. He gave William command and control, titles and responsibility. And William, in return, gave England a sense of consistency during the reign of an often absent monarch. But Richard's death ushered in perhaps William's greatest political challenge. King John, the youngest son of Henry II, John was notorious for his volatility, his suspicion, and his insecurity. Many noblemen fell out of favor. Many faced confiscation of property or exile. But not William. He remained. Carefully, calmly, he offered service when asked. He withheld judgment when provoked. John, for all his paranoia, saw something in William that he didn't see in most of his counsel: a lack of ambition. William never jostled for position, never sought to embarrass rivals, never raised his voice in council chambers. And because of that, John came to rely on him. When baronial tensions grew, when lands were threatened and wars loomed, it was William whom John called upon. He was dispatched to negotiate, to calm, to warn. William, even in his older age, rode into battle when summoned, including during John's campaigns in France. And he did so not as a man desperate for honor, but as a servant fulfilling duty. Then, in the final act of this extraordinary career, William stepped forward once more after John's death. The kingdom teetered. The barons had rebelled. A child king, Henry III, stood in name only, and William, now in his 70s, was named Regent of England. It was an unprecedented move. This was not the standard passing of titles. It was an act of collective trust. Nobles, clergy, and the people recognized that if anyone could hold the kingdom together, it was William Marshal. Not because he was the loudest voice, but because he had always been the most measured. He ruled as regent with modesty. He signed letters with humility. He negotiated the withdrawal of foreign forces, reaffirmed royal charters, and preserved the delicate balance of English governance. His loyalty to the crown had become loyalty to the realm itself. His entire career, in retrospect, was an arc of patience, of strategic silence, of quietly doing what needed to be done, never too much, never too little. He survived 4 kings because he never allowed himself to become their tool, nor their enemy. He was something rarer, their compass. This, then, is what loyalty looked like in medieval England. It was not loud declarations or gaudy displays. It was knowing when to speak, knowing when to wait, and above all, knowing whom to serve, not just a man but an idea, a kingdom, a people. And William Marshal, in serving all 4, served us all by leaving behind a model not of conquest, but continuity. By the time William Marshal was appointed regent, he was not merely a knight or a nobleman. He was an institution. At around 70 years of age, his body bore the weight of countless campaigns, and his face was etched with the lines of diplomacy and discretion. Yet in this final act of service, he would take on the greatest responsibility of all, ruling England in the name of a child. King John's death in 1216 left the realm on the brink of collapse. The First Barons' War had fractured loyalties across the country, and Prince Louis of France had already landed on English shores, claiming the crown by invitation of the rebellious barons. John's heir, the 9-year-old Henry III, was far too young to rule, and the legitimacy of his claim was under immediate threat. In such a fragile and volatile moment, it would have been easy for powerful nobles to grab what they could, to seize castles, redistribute wealth, or even claim the throne themselves. Instead, England turned to an elderly man with no dynastic claim, no vast personal army, and no hunger for more. They turned to William Marshall. Why him? Because he had served 4 kings without betrayal. Because he had never tried to rule from behind the throne. Because he'd become, over the decades, a symbol of reliability in a kingdom that had become synonymous with betrayal. Marshall was, by then, a known quantity, neither overly ambitious nor easily swayed. He had nothing left to prove and everything to preserve. His appointment as regent was not simply practical, it was restorative. At a time when the kingdom needed an image of unity, Marshall's reputation bridged deep divides. Even rebel barons saw in him a man of principle, one who could be trusted not to use power for personal vengeance. His leadership during this regency period was marked by restraint and wisdom. Marshall prioritized healing over punishment. He reissued the Magna Carta, this time with edits designed to appeal more broadly. He didn't wield the document as a political tool against adversaries, but as a balm to restore social and legal trust. His approach was methodical and deliberate, never reactionary. He brought a sense of calm to every crisis, a sense of slowness that, paradoxically, quickened the repair of a shattered realm. When leading troops in defense of the realm, he did so from horseback, not a high tower. In 1217, he rode into battle at Lincoln, despite his advanced age, demonstrating physical courage as well as administrative skill. His success at Lincoln not only ended the French invasion, but re-established internal confidence in the monarchy. Even foreign observers remarked on the extraordinary nature of a man of such years wielding the sword not for ambition, but for obligation. Marshall's regency included relentless correspondence with local lords, bishops, and foreign dignitaries. He convened councils, mediated disputes, and oversaw the collection of taxes with fairness. He operated less as a monarch and more as a guardian, a steward who borrowed power on behalf of a future king. In every decision, he thought not of his legacy, but of continuity. He did not seek to stamp his name on the realm, but to guide it safely through a dangerous chapter. He also understood the symbolism of action. When he paid homage to the young king in public ceremonies, it was not just a ritual, it was reassurance. When he insisted that justice be dispensed fairly to loyalists and rebel alike, it was not just governance, it was healing. William's reign as regent was not defined by innovation, but by preservation, of peace, of process, of the delicate threads of medieval order. Importantly, William did not attempt to extend his regency beyond necessity. As Henry III aged and began to take on more responsibilities, Marshall stepped back, never clinging to the reins of power. This set an example for future regents and helped ensure the peaceful transfer of control. Even in stepping away, he instructed the next generation not in words, but in the manner of his departure, graceful, complete, and unburdened. His administrative actions during the regency were equally telling. William made it a point to maintain the functioning of the exchequer, to hold the royal seal only as long as was necessary, and keep a measured distance from hereditary claims or the idea of kingship for his own bloodline. His sons would inherit land and title, but never a crown. That distinction preserved the young king's authority and reinforced Marshall's role as servant rather than sovereign. He employed diplomacy with clarity and courtesy. Letters written during this time reflect a tone of patience, often imploring feuding nobles to think of their children, their lands, and the peace of the realm rather than the pride of short-term grievances. He was not a man to command loyalty through fear. He earned it through steadiness, through trust. His military strategy also emphasized defense over aggression. Rather than raising towns loyal to Louis or punishing them, he focused on re-establishing English control in symbolic ways, by restoring abbots to their positions, granting pardons, and rebuilding bridges both literal and metaphorical. And perhaps most significantly, he showed the people of England what good rule could look like. He did not need to stage grand events or issue dramatic proclamations. In fact, it was his moderation, his absence of vanity, that became the most powerful example. For a generation raised under King John's shadow, a king remembered for cruelty and disorder, Marshall represented an alternative. That authority could be wielded with patience, wisdom, and fairness. Even after his death, the institutions he helped preserve, Magna Carta, royal councils, legal reforms, formed the basis for English governance in the century to follow. His influence lived on in structure, not just in story. In the quiet corners of royal records, in the dry parchment of legal restoration, in the memory of barons once ready to rebel, William Marshall's regency left an imprint deeper than any battlefield. He ruled not with spectacle, but with service. And in that quiet stewardship, he became not only the greatest knight of his age, but its most necessary guardian. William Marshall, the greatest knight of his age, concluded his life not with spectacle, but with solemn humility. As his body began to fail and the demands of statecraft diminished, Marshall made a final, quiet decision. He joined the Knights Templar, not to seek war, but to seek peace. In this final act, the warrior laid down his sword, exchanged his heraldic banners for a simple white mantle, and prepared for the only journey he would not return from. This was not an unusual path for some nobles of his age, but for Marshall, it was deeply symbolic. After a life defined by loyalty, battle, and the burdens of power, he chose to die not in a hall of gold or on a bloodied field, but as a monk, a servant of God, stripped of title, rank, and wealth. His choice signaled a return to simplicity, to silence, and to service. In a culture that glorified death in battle or triumphant exits, Marshall's was a departure marked by reflection. On his deathbed, he summoned his family, his friends, and his priests. He spoke plainly of his sins and sought no great retelling of his victories. Instead, he asked to be remembered as faithful to God, to his lords, to his word. He took the vows of the Templar Order shortly before his passing, a final pledge of devotion to an ideal larger than any crown. For a man who had witnessed the worst of ambition, the cruelty of politics, and the cost of loyalty, this choice represented a gentle rebellion against the world he had mastered. Marshall's funeral was held at Temple Church in London, the spiritual heart of the Templar Order in England. There was no excessive ceremony, no grand procession of conquest. He was laid to rest with dignity among the order's brethren, as one of them, not above, not apart. Today, his effigy remains there, carved in stone with his hands on his chest, sword resting beside him. Not drawn, not raised, but quiet. And yet, even in this quietness, the symbolism resounds. The sword, present but unused, suggests not a man deprived of strength, but one who has chosen restraint. His stone-carved figure is not standing in defiance, but resting, finally, after a lifetime of vigilance. This posture is an echo of his final days. Not weak, but at peace. Not forgotten, but finished. Marshall's death echoed through the halls of England, not because it shocked the realm, but because it reminded them of a virtue rarely celebrated: restraint. He could have died a duke. He could have clung to his regency or elevated his sons through force. Instead, he stepped aside and knelt. And in kneeling, he stood tallest. His decision carried a spiritual and political message. It was an assertion that even the most powerful men must yield, that ambition must eventually make way for grace, and that a life of battle, if it is to be truly noble, must end in surrender, not of principle, but of ego. He took his vows not for show, but with solemnity. The Templars, despite their martial image, were monastic at their core. Their rule required prayer, poverty, obedience, and chastity. Marshall, who had once dominated tournaments and stood at the right hand of kings, now stood humbly among warrior monks, not seeking command, but fellowship. In doing so, he reconciled two halves of himself, the knight and the penitent. And in that reconciliation, he offered a model of completeness. That glory without humility is brittle. That service, not splendor, is the true knight's calling. That the end of the story can and should return to stillness. His end also gave form to the medieval ideal of a good death, one that came with dignity, confession, humility, and preparation. In a world where many fell anonymously in battle or died amidst political upheaval, Marshall's passing offered a model of transition, from power to peace, from armor to cloth, from struggle to surrender. In the weeks that followed, chronicles recorded his passing not with lament, but with reverence. Chroniclers, often drawn to the extravagant, pause in quiet admiration. The man who could have taken more, took less. The man who could have ruled longer, yielded sooner. He did not leave behind monuments of stone or declarations of conquest. He left behind a memory of a man who carried the burdens of many, who wielded his sword with honor, and who, in the end, sought no glory greater than to serve. But even more than that, Marshall's final act helped shape the cultural imagination of what a noble ending could look like. In an age where violence was commonplace and power transitions brutal, his quiet submission to the cloister echoed with dignity. He did not pass into legend through bloodshed or rebellion, but through acceptance, through choosing to become small so that the legacy of kingship could remain large. Those who came after him remembered his steadiness. His sons and grandsons inherited not just his lands, but his name, often spoken with a kind of reverence that outlasted the temporary noise of conquests. His example was invoked in times of crisis, not as a model of aggression, but as a beacon of judicious calm. In literature, in sermons, in political treatises, his story found its place, not as a saga of ceaseless victory, but as a parable of self-restraint. And in that legacy lies his true monument, not built of stone or gilded manuscripts, but quietly embedded in the ethical memory of a troubled age. Later generations of knights and nobles look back on William Marshall's twilight years not as an afterthought, but as a culminating lesson. As Europe moved into the 13th century, a time of increasing tension between spiritual ideals and worldly power, his final decision remained instructive. For every noble entangled in the temptations of court intrigue, Marshall's quiet humility offered a corrective. For every warrior driven by conquest, his monk's robe served as a whisper of wisdom. Even in the courts of kings, where tales of Arthur and Roland stir the hearts of knights, Marshall's story endured, not for dragons slain or crowns seized, but for an inner triumph, the ability to let go, to walk away, to bow one's head, not before another man, but before the way of a life well lived. His final chapter did not burn bright like a comet. It glowed like a candle, steady, enduring, and serene. And for those seeking sleep, as you now lie in quiet thought, let his journey remind you that in the stillness, there is peace. Chapter 3. The Chivalric Code, Beautiful Lies and Real Lives. The word chivalry floats gently through our collective imagination, polished by centuries of storytelling. It brings to mind shining armor, noble quests, unwavering loyalty, and the tender adoration of fair maidens. It evokes images of knights kneeling solemnly before kings, offering devout service to church and crown. But beneath that gleaming exterior lies a more complex and far less tidy reality. In this chapter, we explore the gap between the ideal and the actual, the aspirational rhetoric of the chivalric code, and the messy, contradictory lives of the men who were supposed to live by it. We examine what knights said they stood for and what they often did instead. And we will do so not with the goal of tearing down an ideal, but of understanding how aspirational myth often coexists uneasily with human limitation. As you settle in and allow the rhythm of the past to gently unfold around you, imagine yourself seated at a wooden bench in a candlelit hall, the air thick with incense and whispered Latin prayers. A bard recites tales of Lancelot and Galahad, while the knights around you sip warmed wine and quietly exchange tales of border skirmishes, unpaid debts, and less than honorable deals. What follows is a story behind those stories, the beautiful lies and the real lives they covered. Let us begin. Chivalry, in its written form, was a patchwork of virtues: courage, courtesy, honor, loyalty, and defense of the weak. But unlike the oaths of fealty that legally bound knights to lords, the chivalric code held no consistent legal authority. It was a code of conduct upheld not by courts, but by social expectation and literary imagination. It existed in sermons and romances and on the lips of poets, less a contract and more suggestion, idealized more often in theory than in deed. Knighthood itself was already an expensive, exclusive station. The performance of honor, then, became as much about appearances and alignment with chivalric language as about action. A knight could extol the virtues of loyalty while negotiating secret allegiances. He could boast of defending the weak while profiting from their labor or raising their villages under the banner of holy war. In this way, chivalry was aspirational, but selectively so. Much like modern reputational ethics or political branding, it offered a template by which knights could claim moral authority, whether or not they adhered to it in practice. This created an enormous dissonance between public image and private action. One of the clearest illustrations of this dissonance lies in the crusading era. Knights who took up the cross swore to uphold Christian virtue and protect pilgrims on their journey to the Holy Land. Yet many campaigns were marked by looting, infighting, and the indiscriminate massacre of civilians. These actions were sometimes lamented in chronicles, but more often justified under the convenient umbrella of divine will. The chivalric code remained intact in rhetoric, while reality bent around expedience. Even within Christian Europe, the code bent easily. Knights were known to break truces, seize church lands, and engage in private wars for personal gain. Trials for knightly misconduct were rare and usually politically motivated. And when knights faced excommunication or disgrace, their rehabilitation often depended less on their moral conduct and more on their value to powerful allies. That said, we must not assume the code had no influence. It did shape behavior, particularly in public, ceremonial, or courtly spaces. Knights who aspired court positions or wished to impress patrons often cultivated a chivalric reputation. Their letters, dedications, and tournament performances were filled with rhetorical nods to honor and humility. In some cases, chivalric values did guide restraint, knights sparing opponents in combat or intervening in abuses of power. But these instances, while real, were not the norm. It's helpful to think of chivalry as a kind of soft power, an invisible pressure that influenced but did not command. Its impact was strongest when aligned with self-interest or public expectation, and weakest when survival, profit, or political necessity stood in its way. Peasants and commoners, those most likely to suffer from unchivalric behavior, had little recourse. The chivalric code rarely extended to them in practice. Knights might speak of protecting the weak, but those words were often meant for their own class. When famine struck or revolts broke out, knights were quick to enforce order through violence. Their role as enforcers of elite stability outweighed any supposed obligation to mercy. The church attempted to institutionalize chivalric ideals through reforms such as the Peace and Truce of God, which sought to limit violence against non-combatants and within Christian lands. These efforts had some success, but enforcement remained inconsistent. Bishops could excommunicate offenders, but such sentences were often overturned or ignored if the knight held enough secular clout. One must also consider the political use of chivalry. Monarchs and nobles often invoked chivalric language to sanctify war, to justify conquest, or to rally support. The 100 Years' War, for example, was cast by both the French and English as a righteous endeavor tied to dynastic legitimacy and divine will. Knights on both sides framed their participation as chivalric duty, even as their armies laid waste of towns and left civilians destitute. And so, in castles and churches, in courts and camps, chivalry existed as an echo of idealism, a banner under which knights might gather, even as their deeds strayed far from the code. It is tempting to see this as hypocrisy, but it is perhaps more accurate to see it as the human condition playing out within constraints of power and pressure. The code endured, not because it was universally followed, but because it was universally needed. It provided a language for aspiration. A knight who acted justly could point to chivalry as his guide. A knight who faltered could invoke it to seek redemption. And a ruler could use it to shape the narrative of his reign. Even today, the myths of chivalry endure, not in their accuracy, but in their comfort. They offer us stories of honor in a chaotic world, of order and disorder. And while we may now see more clearly the gap between those stories and the lives they described, the power of the myth remains. Let your mind rest here, gently turning over the notion that some of the most enduring ideas in history have not been upheld by law, but by longing. And in that longing, in that persistent reaching towards something better, there lies a kind of quiet beauty, flawed, yes, but not without worth. When one envisions a chivalric code, it is easy to assume it sprang from the brutal necessities of battle, that it was born in full from the blood and discipline of the battlefield. But the truth is far softer and perhaps stranger. The chivalric code, as it came to be recognized in medieval Europe, did not arise from military training grounds or ancient warrior customs. Instead, it emerged from the pens of poets, the courts of noble women, and the pages of fantastical romances that bore little resemblance to the mud-soaked campaigns of real knights. The earliest roots of chivalry, as a concept of noble behavior, took shape in the 11th and 12th centuries, a time when the knightly class was becoming more socially distinct. Knights had long existed as mounted warriors, But it was not until this period that the notion of chivalry as a moral and cultural ideal began to solidify, and it did so largely through literature. Troubadours and court poets, many of them active in southern France and northern Italy, composed lyric poems and tales that elevated the image of the knight far beyond his grim function as a soldier. These works described knights who were not merely strong, but virtuous, gallant, refined, and deferential to ladies. The idea of courtly love, so closely associated with chivalry today, emerged not from martial necessity, but from poetic invention. It was a genre of desire wrapped in impossibility. Knights longing for noble women they could never have, pledging eternal devotion through sighs and song rather than consummation or conquest. This literary culture was deeply influential. Nobles, including women who served as patrons of these poets, absorbed and perpetuated these ideals. The chanson de geste, a form of epic poem, began to recast historical conflicts into stories of moral drama, painting crusaders and knights in shining hues. Figures like Roland and Percival became not just warriors, but symbols of virtue and Christian endurance. Perhaps most influential of all were the Arthurian legends, beginning with Geoffrey of Monmouth's 12th century writings and later embellished by authors like Chrétien de Troyes. These tales place a chivalric ideal into a setting of pure fantasy. The Round Table was a place where valor and virtue coexisted, where knights faced moral trials as well as physical ones. Dragons and maidens, enchanted forests and holy relics, all wove together into a tapestry where courage, piety, and gentility reigned supreme. But these were stories, and though they were deeply loved and widely copied, they were always, fundamentally, fiction. Real knights read these texts, admired them, even aspired to their values, but they did not live by them in the thick of battle or the politics of feudal allegiance. These tales offer an emotional and aesthetic ideal, not an operational guide. In fact, it was not uncommon for knights to be illiterate. Many relied on clerics or scribes to read to them or summarize the works of chivalry. In such cases, the stories became performative scripts, idealized mirrors in which to imagine themselves reflected, but rarely practical manuals for behavior. A knight might memorize lines from Chrétien de Troyes, but his swordplay was honed in barracks, not ballads. The literary roots of chivalry also help explain its contradictions. Within Arthurian romances, knights often face moral ambiguity, protecting honor versus obeying one's lord, remaining loyal to king or to love. These internal tensions mirrored the lived experience of medieval knighthood far more than any rigid moral law. The literature provided not consistency, but complexity. Furthermore, the cultural power of these texts meant that chivalry became a performative identity. Knights, and those who aspired to knighthood, acted out chivalric behaviors during tournaments, public ceremonies, and rituals of homage. These settings were as theatrical as they were political. A knight might dedicate his joust to a lady, wear her colors, and proclaim his virtue loudly, even if his last campaign had ended in the sacking of a monastery. In short, chivalry's literary origins reveal it not as a mandate of martial life, but as a product of imagination. It was a style, a story, a script that real knights borrowed from when it suited them, and that bards and chroniclers embroidered with every telling. As you rest in this thought, consider how powerful stories can become, not because they're always true, but because they show us what people wish were true. The chivalric code, born not of swords for the stanzas, was a dream the medieval world tried, imperfectly, to live into. And perhaps that effort, impossible though it was, is what has made it linger so long in our memories. As we look more closely at the literary birth of the chivalric code, it's worth noting just how embedded it became in the very rituals of knighthood. The dubbing ceremony, in which a young squire became a knight, began to incorporate language and gestures borrowed directly from Romance literature. A ceremonial bath, symbolizing purity. A vigil in a chapel, evoking devotion. The laying of a sword on an altar. These were theatrical elements, partly spiritual, partly symbolic, that reinforced the idea of a knight as a moral figure, not just a martial one. And yet, this ideal was cultivated in courts that were just as political as they were poetic. Many of the noble women who patronized courtly poets were themselves deeply involved in the management of estates, the negotiation of marriages, and the navigation of delicate feudal relationships. Their appreciation for tales of restrained affection and noble suffering may have mirrored the constraints of their own lives. In championing the image of the refined knight, they may have been attempting, subtly, to soften the roughness of the warrior caste that surrounded them. Even kings recognized the utility of chivalric literature. Monarchs like Edward III of England and Alfonso X of Castile encouraged the writing and dissemination of knightly tales. By aligning themselves with the legends of Arthur or Charlemagne, rulers tapped into a reservoir of symbolic legitimacy, claiming not just power but virtue. Chivalric literature thus became a tool of both social aspiration and political propaganda. The most telling evidence of chivalry's literary roots, however, may lie in how inconsistently it was applied across cultures. While French and English courts were awash in Arthurian legend, other regions emphasized different ideals. In the Islamic world, for instance, warrior codes like Futuwa emphasized generosity, hospitality, and piety, but lacked the courtly love narrative so prominent in European chivalry. Even within Christendom, Scandinavian sagas and Eastern European traditions showed alternative heroic values, often more brutal, direct, and pragmatic. This suggests that chivalry, far from being a universal warrior ethos, was a culturally contingent narrative, a storytelling tradition that gained traction in specific places and times. And like all stories that evolved by the later Middle Ages, the tales grew more elaborate, the expectations more exaggerated, and the distance from reality more pronounced. And still they endured. Even today, our image of knights is shaped more by the quill than by the lance. The dream of the noble warrior, fighting not for spoils or for honor, not for conquest or for love. That dream echoes in literature, in film, in our collective understanding of medieval life. It is a dream crafted in candlelight, spoken in verse, and passed from one imagining mind to another. And while it may never have been wholly true, it remains, like so many dreams, beautiful in its imperfection. When imagining a knight, one might picture an honorable man loyal to king and cause, fighting for justice, homeland, or perhaps the grace of a noble lady. But in practice, many knights fought not for principle, but for payment. Far from being uniformly noble defenders, a significant portion of the knightly class functioned as professional warriors for hire, soldiers of fortune who pledged loyalty less to ideals and more to coin. During the later Middle Ages especially, the increasing professionalization of warfare blurred the line between knight and mercenary. Though some knights were vassals directly tied by oath to a liege lord, many operated in more flexible, often opportunistic arrangements. These freelances, from which the term freelancing arises, took up arms for the highest bidder, regardless of political allegiance. Mercenary knights traveled across regions, fighting in campaigns far from their native lands. English knights served in Italian city-states. German knights offered their swords to French dukes. The most infamous of these were the routiers, bands of roving soldiers, often led by knights, who terrorized the countryside during peacetime between wars. Nominally Christian and chivalric, these men engaged in extortion, looting, and even hostage-taking to sustain themselves. These practices weren't anomalies, but parts of a broader and widely accepted military economy. Kings and dukes themselves often recruited mercenaries, not out of desperation, but efficiency. Mercenary bands could be quickly assembled, needed no long-term fealty, and were ruthlessly effective. These knights for hire became a fundamental part of many medieval armies, changing the nature of warfare from feudal duty to market-driven conflict. And within these bands, many knights still adhered, outwardly at least, to the forms and appearances of chivalry. They bore coats of arms, rode finely dressed war horses, and participated in rituals of honor. But the motivations beneath the pageantry were largely transactional. Glory and reputation, yes, but only when balanced against cost and risk. Such pragmatism could be seen in the contracts known as indentures, which spelled out the terms of service between a knight and his employer. These documents specified not only pay and duration, but provisions, ransoms, and shares of booty. In this context, chivalric ideals were filtered through meticulous accounting. Honor became something negotiable, quantified, and ultimately subordinate to practicalities. Ransom culture further cemented this mercantile dimension. Knights captured in battle were not executed, but held for ransom, sometimes treated with courtesy if they were of noble birth. This practice, while reflective of chivalric etiquette, was also deeply financial. A well-connected prisoner might be worth more alive than dead. Wars, in many ways, became competitions not only of strength, but of capital. Indeed, the most successful knights were often those who navigated this economic web with precision. Sir John Hawkwood, for instance, an English knight who fought extensively in Italy, became one of the most feared and respected condottieri, leaders of mercenary companies. He amassed wealth, negotiated independently with city-states, and lived out a knightly career completely divorced from the feudal structures of home. His armor gleamed, his banners flew, but his loyalties shifted with the fortunes of the market. And Hawkwood was far from alone. Across Europe, the knight as a salaried professional was more the rule than the exception by the 14th century. The 100 Years' War, with its long duration and shifting alliances, created conditions in which mercenary knights could thrive. They moved from battlefield to battlefield, negotiating new contracts and often leveraging their fame for better terms. Some even formed their own companies, employing other warriors, and became powerful figures in their own right. Equal parts general, entrepreneur, and nobleman. Religious wars, too, failed to escape these dynamics. The Crusades, despite their rhetoric of salvation and divine purpose, were often shaped by economic incentive. Many knights undertook the journey to the Holy Land in hopes of acquiring land or reputation. And crusading orders like the Knights Templar became wealthy financial institutions as well as military forces. Even in the later crusades against heretics in Europe, the Albigensian Crusade in southern France, for instance, knights were promised both absolution and the right to seize lands from the accused. Here, the chivalric language of piety and purity cloaked the realities of conquest and gain. This merging of mercenary motives with chivalric image did not go unnoticed. Satirists and moralists of the time often lamented the hypocrisy. Poets like John Gower and William Langland wrote of the corruption of knighthood, and clerics preached sermons warning that the pursuit of wealth through war endangered the soul. Monastic chroniclers were particularly scathing. They recorded with disappointment how many knights, while mouthing prayers before battle, pursued spoils with more fervor than penitence. These accounts, though biased, reveal the widening gulf between the imagined knight of spiritual warfare and the actual knight of material ambition. And yet, despite all this, the image endured, perhaps because it offered a comforting frame, one in which chaos could be seen as order, greed as duty, and conquest as service. The knight remained a symbol of virtue in a world that increasingly rewarded calculation. So, as we imagine the knights of the Middle Ages, it is important to remember that many were not selfless protectors of the weak, nor champions of lofty ideals. They were professionals, often skilled, often brave, but fundamentally shaped by the economics of their time. They served where they were paid, fought whom they were told, and kept one eye always on the reward. The battlefield may have been muddy and dangerous, but it was also a ledger where every blow and banner could be measured in coin. When we think of knights and their ideals, one image tends to rise above all others. The romantic knight kneeling before a lady, offering his heart in pure devotion. This image, lovingly repeated in tapestries, troubadour songs, and romantic epics, paints the knight not only as a warrior, but as a tender soul, ruled by honor and love. Yet, as with many medieval ideals, the truth was far more complex. Courtly love, while a powerful cultural motif, was more fantasy than lived reality. Originating in the courts of 12th century southern France, the concept of courtly love was closely tied to the lyrical poetry of troubadours and the traditions of noble leisure. These poems and tales spoke of unattainable ladies, idealized virtue and spiritual passion, a form of love that was, paradoxically, noble because it was never consummated. The beloved was usually married, distant, and placed upon a pedestal. The knight lover, often of lower rank, would pledge undying service and endure suffering for mere favor of her glance. But this was literature, not law. Courtly love was never a binding code, nor was it widely practiced in daily life. Rather, it was a narrative structure, a poetic and social game that allowed for the expression of desire within the rigid structures of noble society. It provided a framework for flirtation and artistic expression, not for real social change. In fact, many of its tenets were directly at odds with the actual power dynamics and gender norms of the period. In practice, relationships between knights and noble women were governed less by refined sentiment and more by politics, property, and practicality. Marriages were arranged to consolidate estates, seal alliances, or secure peace. Love, as we understand today, was rarely a consideration. A knight's affection for a noble lady might be voiced in song or performed in tournaments, but these displays were often symbolic. Stylized gestures meant to elevate both the performer and the object as affection in the eyes of their peers. More troublingly, the idealization of women in courtly love coexisted with very real systems of female disenfranchisement. Noble women had little legal autonomy, and lower-class women even less. A knight's romantic poem might extol the virtues of purity and restraint, but off the page, women were often subjected to social control, coercion, and exploitation. The very notion of placing a woman on a pedestal was, in some ways, a tool of containment. Idealization used to mask subjugation. The tension between ideal and reality was not lost on medieval writers themselves. In the Roman De La Rose, a widely read allegorical poem, we see both the exaltation of love and abiding cynicism about its motives. And in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the knightly and romantic ideals are frequently undercut by bawdy humor and ironic distance. These works suggest that even in their own time, the ideals of courtly love were understood to be, at best, aspirational, at worst, performative. Moreover, many knights were far more interested in power and prestige than poetry. Their letters and chronicles rarely speak of romantic longing. Instead, they focus on land disputes, military campaigns, and feudal obligations. The romantic image was cultivated not by knights themselves, but by the clerics and poets who observed or imagined them. Even in the great Arthurian legends, where the ideals of chivalry and courtly love are most fully developed, there is a deep undercurrent of tragedy. Lancelot and Guinevere's doomed affair, Tristan and Isolde's fatal passion. These stories do not celebrate romantic fulfillment. They mourn its impossibility. They present love not as a triumph, but as a noble wound, a source of suffering that ennobles through sorrow. And so, while courtly love has given us some of the most enduring images, it is important to remember that these images were not reflections, but projections. They express not how knights lived, but how some wished to imagine them. They offered a beautiful lie from the messiness of real life. The true loves of knights were often duty, wealth, and legacy. Their real relationships, whether with wives, mistresses, or fellow warriors, were shaped by the same complexities that mark human experience in any era. Beneath the flowing verses and polished armor was a world of compromise, ambition, and restraint. To study courtly love, then, is not to uncover a lost golden age of romance. It is to explore how ideals are constructed and how they shape our expectations, even when they are never truly realized. It is to listen for the quiet voice behind the song, the voice that knows the difference between story and truth, between dream and deed. At first glance, the chivalric code appears to be a moral compass, a set of guiding principles that encourage honor, loyalty, protection of the weak, and virtue in combat. Yet beneath its gilded language and ceremonial trappings, the code of chivalry served another, more insidious function. It reinforced the very social hierarchies it pretended to transcend. In theory, the chivalric knight stood apart from base ambition. He pledged to defend the helpless, respect noble ladies, and serve faithfully. But in practice, these promises were embedded within a deeply feudal and hierarchical system, one that preserved the privileges of the nobility and kept those below them firmly in place. To begin with, chivalry was exclusive. Only members of the knightly and noble classes were expected, or even allowed, to uphold its values. The virtues espoused were not universal moral obligations, but markers of elite status. To be chivalrous was, by definition, to be part of a privileged caste. Peasants, tradesmen, and common foot soldiers were excluded from its protections and from its honors. This exclusivity extended into warfare. Knights were bound by codes that dictated honorable treatment of fellow nobles in battle, including the right to ransom, courteous captivity, and even shared feasts after skirmishes. But these courtesies were rarely extended to common troops. A noble prisoner might be pampered, while a captured peasant might be left to rot or killed without a second thought. Thus, the chivalric code preserved class distinctions even on the battlefield. Moreover, the code idealized a certain vision of the social order as natural and virtuous. Lords were wise, vassals loyal, peasants content in their toil. Knights were portrayed as guardians of this harmony, protecting the land and ensuring justice. But this vision conveniently ignored the systemic injustices built into the feudal structure. It cast the existing hierarchy not as a human construction, but as a moral ideal. This narrative served those in power. It legitimized their authority by cloaking it in noble language. A lord who demanded taxes or enforced harsh justice could frame himself as acting within chivalric bounds, as a necessary guardian rather than a coercive force. The code gave the ruling classes a script by which to present domination as duty. Literature played a key role in this process. Epic poems and romances often celebrated chivalric values in tales of noble sacrifice, courageous combat, and virtuous love. But these tales were written for and by the literate elite. They functioned as cultural reinforcement, reminding the privileged of their imagined nobility and justifying their station. Even the religious overtones of chivalry, which tied knighthood to Christian virtue, contributed to this structure. The idea of the Milites Christi, the soldier of Christ, merged martial power with divine right. Knights were seen not merely as secular warriors, but as instruments of divine justice. This theological veneer elevated their status, while further marginalizing those without access to arms or aristocratic lineage. Crusading ideology took this to its extreme. Knights who fought in the Holy Land were promised forgiveness of sins and eternal glory. This framed colonial violence and conquest as a sacred duty, while presenting the knightly class as spiritual paragons. It blurred the line between salvation and subjugation, and in doing so, reaffirmed the social and spiritual dominance of the warrior elite. The domestic consequences were subtle, but no less enduring. Within estates and castles, chivalry defined proper behavior, not just for knights, but for everyone. It dictated how servants should act, how women should behave, and how younger sons should obey. It created a framework of manners and expectations that maintained order, not through law alone, but through shared cultural narratives. Yet even as it preached virtue, the code provided little real recourse for those it supposedly protected. If a knight mistreated a peasant or abused his power, there were few systems of accountability. The very people who enforced the chivalric ideal were those least likely to be punished for violating it. And so, the code functioned less as a safeguard and more as a mask, hiding the sharp edges of inequality behind a soft language of honor. To understand the chivalric code fully, then, is to recognize it as both aspiration and artifice. It did offer a language of virtue, a model of self-discipline and restraint. But it also served to reinforce who mattered in society and who did not. It made heroes of the few, and in doing so, it kept the many in their place. Chapter 4. The Castle's Keep, a Lady's Quiet Influence. In the long shadow cast by knights, battles, and bold declarations of loyalty, there was another kind of power, silent, deliberate, and often invisible to chroniclers and minstrels. This was the influence of noble women, who held together the fabric of medieval life not with sword or stirrup, but with parchment, patience, and presence. Picture, if you will, the cool interior of a medieval castle solar. The air smells faintly of beeswax, parchment, and drying herbs. A high-backed wooden chair creaks under the weight of a woman whose name you may never read in any chronicle. She is neither poet nor warrior, yet the quill in her hand, poised above the parchment ledger, holds a power as commanding as any sword. To understand the full breadth of noble women's duties in managing estates is to reframe our notion of power in the medieval world. Unlike the theatrical displays of chivalry and the violence of battlefield glory, the administration of a castle and surrounding lands required continuous, quiet labor. Women, particularly noble women whose husbands were away on campaign or engaged in courtly affairs, bore this responsibility with uncelebrated constancy. Estate management was no ceremonial role. It was a daily exercise in economics, logistics, human resource oversight, and crisis response. Castles were not merely homes. They were administrative centers, provisioning depots, and local hubs of justice. The lady of the keep had to monitor the flow of grain, wine, salted meat, wool, and other commodities. Each item had its season, its peril, and its particular method of storage. A miscalculation could spoil the winter supply or leave the garrison underprovisioned. She supervised the stewards, bailiffs, cooks, laundresses, stable hands, and scribes who made up the castle staff. These were not small operations. Even a modest estate might have dozens of people under her indirect management, all needing guidance and discipline. The lady's presence was often symbolic, a stabilizing force within a delicate hierarchy of duties and expectations. Much of her work was performed at the writing desk. She reviewed and compiled inventories of goods, monitored the status of tenant dues, and kept ledgers of transactions. She knew which fields had yielded a strong barley harvest, which tenants were late in paying rent, and which supplier provided subpar wares the year before. Her grasp of the estate's pulse had to be precise. Errors could threaten not only comfort, but survival. In some regions, particularly in England and France during the High Middle Ages, legal records show women signing documents in lieu of absent husbands, managing property disputes, and even appearing in court to assert estate rights. These were not exceptional anomalies, but rather routine practices where women filled in the legal and administrative gaps left by the constant movement of men. Their literacy, which was more widespread among noble women than among common men, became a tool of control and continuity. Even beyond the immediate castle, the lady often oversaw smaller manors or satellite farms tied to the state. She had to know which lands were underperforming, which livestock were breeding well, and which portions of forest could be safely harvested for timber without damaging future yields. Environmental awareness, agricultural insight, and long-term planning. These were the skills expected of her, even if never formally acknowledged. One might imagine her days beginning before dawn with whisper reports from senior servants, her evenings filled with the scratching of quill on parchment by candlelight. There were no laurels or litanies sung for her efficiency, but when the crops came in on time, the guards were fed and the tenants remained loyal. It was her diligence, not her husband's sword, that made it so. This managerial labor was also deeply personal. The castle lady bore the burden of maintaining social harmony. She mediated between squabbling tenants, settled disputes among the household staff, and provided alms and support during famines or plague. Compassionate yet authoritative, she walked a fine line between generosity and firmness. And still, she did all this within a cultural framework that discouraged overt recognition of her power. Her role was idealized as nurturing, passive, and supportive, yet it demanded intellectual acuity, memory, stamina, and judgment. If a knight was forged in the training yard, a lady was forged in the ledger room, the larder, and the delicate calculus of daily governance. Some were better at this than others. Letters survive from noble women who chastised male stewards for mismanaging livestock sales or failing to properly rotate seasonal grain storage. Others negotiated directly with merchants or clergy to secure supplies, manage disputes, or arrange charitable donations in the state's name. This quiet command had another effect. It kept the rhythm of a state life steady during long absences or turbulent times. In periods when lords marched off to war for years at a time, it was a lady's competence that allowed the estate not only to endure, but to thrive. Without her hand, the gears of feudal life risked seizing. There is comfort in imagining her there, seated by the window in the morning light, marking a balance sheet, while a servant reads back the livestock tallies from the barns. The fire has not yet been lit, but she doesn't mind. She has too many tasks for coal to matter. Her work, unseen, unheralded, forms the very bones of continuity. Her influence is not carved in marble, but it is written in ink, pressed into wax, and passed down in the smooth running of a domain that outlives even its master's name. Beyond the realm of ledgers and livestock, noble women occupied another crucial role. Quiet diplomats in the ever-shifting web of medieval alliances. They were born into a world where marriages were treaties, family trees were maps of political power, and a well-worded letter could be more potent than a knight's charge. From adolescence to old age, they were trained not just to marry, but to mediate, to keep lines open where war might otherwise erupt, and to build bridges across bloodlines and borders. When a noble woman married, she did not merely become a wife. She became an envoy of her natal family, a living symbol of alliance and trust. The practice of marrying across rival factions was a core strategy in medieval politics, and women were the linchpins of these arrangements. Through them, peace was brokered, feuds were softened, and influence extended. A lady's manner, her reputation, and her skill in navigating family loyalty versus marital duty could mean the difference between prosperity and prolonged conflict. They did not wield swords, but they wielded access. They knew what words to speak, when to remain silent, and how to gently influence the decisions made in great halls. Their correspondence, carefully composed, sealed with wax, and carried by trusted messengers, was filled with nuance. A single phrase might convey support, hint at hesitation, or signal a shift in loyalty. These letters, many of which survive in archives, reveal fluent command of diplomacy, tone, and strategy. A noble woman might write to her father to advocate for her husband's land grant, or to her brother to reassure him of her loyalty during a tense succession. She might correspond with abbots, stewards, or even monarchs to protect the interests of her household. Her pen, though dainty, could bend powerful currents beneath the surface of formal negotiations. Their influence also extended through courtly networks, through gifts, social visits, religious patronage, and matchmaking. Women arranged or advised on the marriages of their children and relatives, ensuring that alliances remained favorable or that enmities were kept in check. A daughter's betrothal was rarely just a family affair. It was a political maneuver, crafted carefully over months or years. The lady of the house was often central to these plans, assessing dowries, consulting omens, and weighing reputation against fortune. In the absence of husbands, whether due to war, death, or distance, these women often stood as the face of their house. They represented their estates in court, negotiated land disputes, and even managed succession issues. Chroniclers may have minimized their visibility, but local records, legal documents, and letters show a different story, one of capable and consistent presence. Their role as mediators was not limited to external politics. Within households, they reconciled feuding relatives, soothed frayed tempers among advisors, and kept the peace among servants and knights alike. They understood that the household was a microcosm of the wider political world. Its stability, too, required care, tact, and foresight. A noble woman might spend decades nurturing these diplomatic ties, even after widowhood. Dowager ladies often became central nodes in extended family networks, coordinating correspondence between branches of the family tree, managing inheritances, and overseeing the upbringing of grandchildren. They were the keepers of memory and the stewards of continuity. Though rarely granted formal titles like ambassador or steward, their function was no less diplomatic. They advised husbands, counseled sons, and gently corrected errors that could have become disasters. They anticipated the needs of the moment while holding fast to the long memory of kinship, debt, and favor. There is a certain grace in imagining them at their writing tables. Quietly powerful, carefully weighing each word, each name, each seal. The clatter of hooves may pass by their window, nights may come and go, but she is a thread that holds the tapestry together. To see their work is to realize that power need not always be loud. It may live in parchment, in patience, and in the long view of history. And yet, even this account barely scratches the surface of their political acumen. Noble women's diplomatic roles extended into every crevice of medieval society, from negotiating prisoner exchanges to settling terms in property disputes, from mediating tensions between neighboring lords to shielding their family names from scandal. They performed acts of diplomacy not as rare exceptions, but as integral, routine facets of their lives. It is worth remembering that many noble women were well-educated, fluent in Latin or French, versed in scripture, and trained to understand family trees, legal principles, and the subtle language of power. They studied not only religious texts, but also accounts of great women in history, queens, saints, and wise matriarchs who governed with discretion. These were their role models, and they measured themselves not in glory, but in effectiveness. In times of succession crises, when civil wars loomed, or when contested inheritances threatened the peace, it was often a woman who held a family line steady. Consider For instance, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who not only influenced two kingdoms but acted decisively in the dangerous realm of dynastic ambition. Her example may be well known, but it echoes the quieter, unrecorded labors of hundreds of women who did not rule as queens but maintained dynasties all the same. Their diplomacy extended into religion and charity as well. Patronage of abbeys and religious houses was not merely an act of piety. It was a statement of allegiance and reputation. By aligning with powerful monastic networks, noble women gained access to moral authority, financial protection, and ecclesiastical support. These affiliations could be used as bargaining chips, sheltering their households from accusations, winning favor with bishops, or even influencing papal decisions in matters of annulment or inheritance. We also find their influence embedded in wills and dowries, documents rich with conditional clauses, shrewd land distributions, and clauses crafted to protect daughters, sons, and future heirs. These contracts were not the domain of passive witnesses. They were tools wielded with care, foresight, and emotional intelligence by women who understood both the bonds of blood and the volatility of medieval power. Even poetry and song occasionally revealed the woman behind the curtain. Troubadour verses and courtly ballads, when read between the lines, hint at ladies who steered reputations, sponsored artists, or punished slander with calculated social exile. A noble woman did not need to raise her voice to be heard. She needed only to withhold her favor or withhold her invitation, and silence would speak volumes. And so, from parchment to prayer, from dowry to deed, from whispered counsel to lettered plea, these women maneuvered through a landscape both perilous and poised. They were diplomats without office, stateswomen without a throne, their strength not diminished by its quietness, but made more enduring by it. This was the true court of influence, not a place of loud declarations or thunderous applause, but a world of slow, deliberate negotiations, of lives shaped not by the clash of swords, but by the measured curve of script. While noble women often wielded quiet influence in matters of state and diplomacy, another form of power, no less enduring, was exercised in the halls of learning and devotion. In the medieval world, where formal education was a rare privilege and spiritual guidance was central to identity, noble women stood as keepers of knowledge and faith, shaping minds and morals alike. Imagine a stone chamber lit by the golden slant of morning sun. A boy stumbles through Latin conjugations under the gentle correction of a mother or governess. A girl traces her embroidery beside a psalter. This is not merely domestic life. It is a foundational act of medieval continuity. Here, within castle walls, women curated the earliest education of sons who would one day govern, and daughters who would carry estates into new alliances. The education noble women provided was often the only structured instruction available in a child's formative years. Before a boy was sent to a monastery school or to serve as a page in another household, it was usually his mother who taught him his letters, his prayers, and his manners. Her influence would echo even as he learned warfare or law under male tutors. Mothers were expected to instill not only a reverence for God, but also the qualities of leadership, patience, prudence, and restraint. This education was not limited to recitation or decorum. Many noble women were deeply literate themselves, fluent in multiple languages, well-versed in scripture, and familiar with philosophy, poetry, and practical matters such as medicine and estate law. They read not only for personal enrichment, but as active participants in the intellectual life of their time. Some owned private libraries, others commissioned books or illuminated manuscripts. A few, like Marguerite de Navarre or Christine de Pizan, became authors in their own right, challenging the notion that women were silent on matters of intellect. Some households employed chaplains or tutors, but the noble woman often oversaw their instruction and monitored progress, serving as both supervisor and supplemental educator. Lessons were flexible, adaptive to the rhythm of the household. A boy might study letters 1 hour and be led into a discussion of psalms the next, always under the lady's quiet guidance. Even learning to compose a well-worded letter, maintain accounts, or interpret omens in scripture came under her jurisdiction. They also oversaw the religious life of the household, a responsibility that extended well beyond morning prayers. A noble woman coordinated feast day observances, managed chapel staff, and ensured that the family's almsgiving and religious obligations were met. She might sponsor a priest or friar, fund a shrine, or arrange masses for the souls of departed kin. These acts were deeply personal and deeply political, affirming her family's piety, stability, and place within the divine order. A well-maintained chapel within the manor was a symbol of both reverence and authority. The lady selected which saints to honor, managed the seasonal rotation of rituals, and chose the vestments or books used in devotion. She might even influence sermons through guidance to the household priest, especially in reinforcing familial values and moral order. For young girls in particular, the castle lady shaped not only behavior, but belief. She was both model and instructor, passing on virtues such as humility, charity, patience, and devotion. In some cases, daughters were sent to convents for formal schooling. But even then, it was often the mother who arranged such placements, corresponded with abbesses, and oversaw her daughter's moral development from afar. Some women turned their own households into centers of religious learning. They hosted clergy, invited monks to speak, and facilitated theological debate. A noblewoman's hall could be a place of inquiry, not just ritual, and her voice often guided the moral compass of her court. In regions where monasteries were distant or under threat, her leadership became vital. Noble women also functioned as guardians of family memory through storytelling and religious ritual. They curated oral histories: who was married to whom, who betrayed whom, who gave generously or died faithfully. Through these quiet remembrances, they preserved not only the family's honor, but its lessons. They kept their children mindful of legacy, not in terms of inheritance alone, but in behavior and belief. Stories became a form of soft instruction, embedded with values. Many of these women took spiritual vows of their own, not cloistered, but within lay society. They wore devotional rings, observed private fasts, and kept prayer journals. Some formed spiritual friendships with monks or nuns, exchanging letters that blended theology with personal reflection. Others entered lay confraternities, joining networks of devotion that wielded soft influence across Europe. These networks extended their influence further. A noble woman who supported a particular order or abbey gained access to its scribes, archives, and advisors. Her name might be entered in prayer rolls, and her family remembered at every mass. Her influence became spiritual capital, exchanged in both this world and the next. And for widows, especially, religious life often became a vocation. A dowager might retire to a convent she helped found, or take a vow of chastity while continuing to oversee her estate. In doing so, she modeled an ideal of piety married to leadership, living proof that a woman could be both devout and decisive. Some wielded such influence from within the convent walls that they effectively directed the political affairs of regions, using their spiritual stature as leverage. Even the very structure of medieval piety bore the fingerprints of noble women. They sponsored the building of chapels, ordered relics, and commissioned altarpieces. Their donations shaped liturgies and ensured that monks would pray for their families in perpetuity. In quiet ways, they negotiated their place in heaven just as they had once negotiated dowries and land claims. To the modern observer, it may seem curious to consider these acts, lighting a candle, sewing a robe, copying a prayer, as power. But within the medieval world, these were foundational. Through them, women formed the ethical spine of society. They passed on discipline, charity, and endurance. And in doing so, they shaped a generation of rulers and retainers who carried these ideals outward into the world. Thus, to walk through a medieval castle was to walk through a place not only of strategy and economy, but of instruction and invocation. And at its center, quietly and faithfully, was the lady of the house, teacher, patron, intercessor, and guardian of the soul. It is in times of uncertainty that the true foundations of a household are tested. And in medieval life, uncertainty came often through war, famine, siege, illness, and political upheaval. In these moments, the calm hand of the noble woman frequently became the axis upon which entire estates turned. She did not always lead from the front, but she held the seams of society together with a quiet strength often underestimated. Consider the castle during a siege, a looming threat beyond the walls, provisions running low, tension in every corridor. While men were at the battlements, it was often the lady of the house who coordinated rations, arranged for care of the sick, and kept servants steady. She ensured that food was not wasted, that prayers were said at the appointed hours, and that fear did not turn inward to chaos. When letters needed to be sent requesting aid or surrender terms, she was frequently the one composing them, choosing each word with care, speaking diplomacy even under threat. Historical records tell us of noble women who defended castles in their husbands' absence. One such figure was Nicola de Lahaye, who commanded the defense of Lincoln Castle during the First Barons' War in the early 13th century. Her command was not a rare novelty. It was a lived reality for many women who, when faced with siege or rebellion, took charge not through violence, but through structure, clarity, and resolve. Crisis took many forms, and it was not always an enemy with a sword. There were the crises of succession, when a lord died without a clear heir or a child was too young to inherit. In such moments, it was often the widow who stood as guardian, protector, and negotiator. She defended the child's claim, secured alliances, and kept the estate from falling into disrepair or dispute. These women knew the law, the lineage, and the importance of appearing composed, even when the future of everything they had built seemed uncertain. Famine and illness too tested their resolve. When crops failed or illness swept through the village, it was a noble woman who often supervised the distribution of stored grain, arranged for herbal remedies, or organized prayers and pilgrimages. Her concern was not merely charity. It was strategic compassion, a form of leadership that preserved loyalty and social cohesion. She understood that even the smallest gestures, bread shared at the gate, a word of comfort from the hall, had ripple effects. In internal household crises, such as betrayal among retainers or tensions between steward and reeve, she again played the mediator. Her role was to maintain harmony, address grievances, and hold the delicate balance of authority. And because she often understood the lives of her household intimately, servants, cooks, laundresses, and grooms, her interventions carried a moral weight, often more persuasive than decree. She also stabilized transitions. In times when sons returned from war broken in spirit, or when daughters were married into unfamiliar households, the lady of the castle provided emotional and cultural continuity. Her hall was a place where traditions were remembered, where songs were sung as they always had been, and where rites were performed that connected generations. Her presence grounded the past into the present. This stabilizing presence extended to the broader community. Villagers and tenants looked to the lady for cues on behavior, for permission to hope or grieve. She was often the first to organize seasonal festivals again after hardship, to reopen the church doors, to signal that life would continue. Her resilience radiated outward. At times, her influence could even prevent violence. If neighboring estates quarreled or a tenant faced harsh penalties, it was often the lady who interceded, quietly, respectfully, and with measured authority. Her advocacy might be the difference between resolution and ruin. All this she did while upholding the daily rhythm of the household, ensuring candles were made, bread was baked, and prayers were observed. To preserve order was not a simple act of habit. It was resistance to chaos. She was not a general, yet she led. Not a priest, yet she consoled. Not a king, yet she ruled in the spaces left open by absence or misfortune. The legacy of these women rarely entered the annals of great battles or public proclamations, but they are there in the steady survival of lineages, the continuity of estates, and the quiet rebuilding after ruin. Their leadership was not a moment of glory, but a season of endurance. Thus, the castle's stability was not built solely on stone or sword, but on the unyielding calm of the woman who walked its halls, smoothing tension with a word, sustaining life with a plan, and reminding all who served that dignity could be maintained even in the darkest hours. In times of warfare that lasted seasons or disputes that spanned generations, these women with a human memory of compromise. When borders shifted or castles exchanged hands, it was often the women who carried forward the oral histories and oaths that could be called upon to temper vengeance or renew peace. Their knowledge of feuds, marriages, and land rights, passed down through both documents and whispered recollections, was a stabilizing archive in itself. During the Great Interregnum or civil unrest, when central authority frayed, local power often depended on the credibility of the lady of the estate. Her calm face at the manor gate reassured frightened villagers. Her presence at Mass gave legitimacy to rituals and traditions. She ensured the bells were rung not just for celebration, but for mourning, for gathering, for remembrance, and in doing so, kept the rhythm of life from dissolving into panic. When famine returned in cycles and plague arrived unbidden, it was she who rationed not only flour and cloth, but words. Her instructions on what to conserve, who to feed first, how to bury the dead, were practical and sacred. These were not moments for pity, they were moments for preservation. The decisions she made in those weeks could determine whether the household survived another season. And though we often think of knights and kings when imagining the defenders of castles, some of the most determined guardians were mothers and widows. There are records, though often brief, of noble women refusing terms of surrender, organizing watch rotations, even issuing commands in their husbands' names. Their presence reminded all within the walls that duty did not pause when man left for war. It simply changed hands. Emotional endurance was another form of leadership. When word arrived that a son had died in battle or a lord had been captured, it was a lady who kept the household from collapse. She mourned, yes, but privately, with the dignity expected of her station. Her grief was woven into ceremony, a black ribbon tied at a chapel gate, an extra candle lit, a psalm hummed softly in the morning. Through these gestures, she gave permission for others to grieve and strength to continue. We see traces of this leadership in chronicles and estate rolls. We find her fingerprints in letters sent across regions to maintain political ties, in inventories that account for every store of grain, in the marginalia of prayer books asking for safe passage or strength. In the very preservation of archives, we see her hand, sometimes literally, in careful script, other times in survival whole estates through periods when every surrounding manor fell. Castles were not fortresses of stone alone. They were fortresses of continuity. And the noble woman was its keystone. When others fell into despair, she reminded them of harvests yet to come. When the world felt rudderless, she became the compass. When the land fell silent under snow, or war, her voice, measured and calm, kept stories alive by the hearth. In an age without mass communication or formal emergency response, the presence of a woman capable of calming households, feeding mouths, preserving laws, and holding memory was as essential as a knight with a sword or a mason with mortar. These were not secondary roles. They were the hidden pillars of feudal endurance. Thus, in every moment of collapse, there was also quiet rebuilding, and often it began with her, the one who lit the fire each morning, who sang the old song, who opened the ledger and penned down the rents, who knew which herb eased fever, and who remembered, better than most, what it meant to begin again. In medieval society, where power was frequently measured in titles, armor, and loud declarations, the influence of noble women operated along a different axis, one less visible, but no less potent. Their authority was rarely declared in public forums or battlefield conquests. Instead, it manifested in subtle decisions, daily gestures, and the shaping of reputations, alliances, and expectations over time. A noble woman did not often stand at the head of a council or bear the legal right to dictate royal policy. Yet, within the walls of the manor or the quiet cloister of correspondence, her words could nudge decisions and steer futures. Her power lived in the tone of a letter sent to a neighboring lord, in the arrangement of seats at a feast, or in the choice of which young knight to favor with praise or disapproval. She wielded influence through patronage. By supporting poets, scribes, monks, and artisans, she ensured her family's name and image were carried into song, prayer, and record. These acts were more than cultural, they were strategic. A song sung in court could shift public opinion. A prayer commissioned from a revered monk could sway a bishop. In sponsoring art and education, she shaped the narrative of her house's legacy. Marriage arrangements were another venue for indirect authority. Often tasked with preparing dowries and overseeing engagements, noble women negotiated with other households not just for alliances, but for influence. Through the weaving of kinship, they extended their family's web of support, ensured stability in border territories, and secured diplomatic peace. Her choices in these unions had long-term political implications, and while her decisions were framed as familial duties, they often reflected deep tactical thinking. Even within her own household, her preferences mattered. A raised eyebrow at a steward's suggestion, a word of encouragement to a timid servant, or a subtle invitation extended to a visiting noble. All of these shaped the atmosphere and direction of estate life. Gossip, praise and silence were tools she understood well. With them, she could raise or ruin a person standing without ever issuing command. Material symbolism, too, played its part. The gifting of cloth, the hosting of feasts, the careful display of inherited relics. These were not simply matters of aesthetic or tradition. They were statements about continuity, loyalty, and strength. The lady of the house understood that every gesture, every arrangement, and every absence was read by those around her, and she curated her presence with intent. Then there were her spiritual endorsements. By choosing which pilgrimages to sponsor, which saints to honor, or which relics to display, she connected her household to broader spiritual and political networks. These choices influenced which monastic order supported her family, how the local clergy addressed her kin, and what moral narratives were attached to her family's legacy. In times of tension between rival families, a lady might be the only one capable of opening back channels. Through friendships with other noble women, through a shared past at a convent or mutual godparent ties, she could mediate disputes that knights and lords could not resolve. These informal channels, built over years of quiet hospitality, gift-giving, and shared confidences, were soft power at its most enduring. And perhaps most important of all, her influence lived on in memory. The songs she sponsored, the marriages she brokered, the stories she passed down by the hearth. These outlived the battles of her time. They shaped the sense of belonging for generations, ensured loyalty during succession, and built the emotional and cultural capital that proved more resilient than gold or steel. Her power was not recorded in royal charters or carved into triumphal arches. It was recorded in the choices that preserved harmony, the patterns of behavior she fostered, the kinship she protected, and the traditions she ensured were never broken. And because it was quiet, it was often enduring. Thus, in the measured calm of the noble woman's gaze, in the graceful precision of her handwritten letter, in the careful choreography of a feast, lived a different kind of rule, one that left no battlefield, but preserved entire worlds. Her indirect power extended to managing reputation, not only her own, but that of her family and household. In a world where public image determined marriage prospects, alliances, and even security, the lady's word could safeguard or endanger generations. She shaped this image through choices both large and small, how guests were received, how servants were treated, which festivals were celebrated, and which grievances were allowed to fade. In her, the household found not only etiquette, but ethos. And then there was her role as guardian of memory. Often she was the last to remember certain odes or feuds, to recall the original intention behind a patch of disputed land, or to whisper the truth of an old scandal long buried. This informal archive of knowledge, carried not in books but in quiet recollection, was a form of wisdom that helped avert unnecessary wars, smoothed over past slights, and allowed reconciliation to be achieved not through treaties but through trust. Her correspondence, though rarely included in chronicles, reveals a world of negotiation, kindness, and veiled authority. In letters written with careful penmanship and deliberate restraint, she appealed to bishops, mediated feuds, encouraged loyalty among vassals, and requested favors with such tact that refusal became politically unwise. She was, in many respects, a stateswoman without title. In the education of her daughters, she passed on these tools of influence: when to speak, when to remain silent, how to interpret gesture and tone, how to survive in courts and corridors of power where loud voices rarely rule for long. The art of enduring influence was taught not through textbooks, but through years of shared experience, an apprenticeship of womanhood. Even in death, her influence lingered. Through the burial location she chose, the endowment she left behind, or the relics she preserved, she shaped the spiritual and social legacy of her household. Tomb inscriptions commissioned by her children spoke not only of piety, but of gratitude, for stability, for guidance, for survival. So it is not surprising that many castles remembered not just the lords who rode to war, but the ladies who kept the lamps lit. They became part of the architecture of memory, honored in chapel carvings, remembered in seasonal songs, and invoked in times of uncertainty as figures of calm, consistency, and care. Their rule may have left few laws behind, but it left impressions in the soft habits of culture, in how to host a guest, how to navigate loyalty, how to endure quietly, and how to lead without force. It is in these invisible inheritances that we find the enduring reign of a noble woman, not one of spectacle, but of substance, And though they did not sit upon thrones or lead armies, noble women shaped decisions that echoed across regions. Their selections of godparents, their blessings on inheritances, and even the timing of their patronage for religious festivals subtly orchestrated regional politics. When famine threatened, their household stores fed villages. When conflict brewed, they brokered peace through letters and dowries. In many ways, their invisible touch was a salve against chaos. A visiting cleric might recall not a lord's decree, but the quiet dignity with which a lady greeted him in the hall. A young steward, decades later, might remember that it was a lady who first taught him how to hold authority with grace. The reach of her influence was intangible yet widespread, lived out in the conduct of others long after she had gone. And in literature, even where unnamed, her image endured. The wise matron, the gracious hostess, the discreet advisor. These were not mere tropes. They were echoes of real women who balanced power with humility, influence with silence, and leadership with care. In every faded tapestry that showed a lady offering bread to a pilgrim, or in every marginal note in a ledger book noting a new midwife hired at her request, we glimpse a life of continual stewardship. It was not ceremonial, it was transformative. The castle's peace, the estate's rhythms, the family's fortunes, they all pulsed at the pace she set. Conclusion. And so we come to the quiet end of our journey. One that began in the clang of armor and ended in the hush of candlelight within a castle keep. We have walked beside knights as they trudged through mud, felt the aching pull of their vows, and counted the coins they spent on steel and survival. We stood beside William Marshall, the silent champion whose loyalty outlasted kings. We looked behind the banners of chivalry and saw a world of contradictions, of stories told louder than they were lived. And we listened, finally, to the women in the halls, those who rarely raised their voices, but who shaped everything their world could not do without. The truth of the knightly world was not found in the shine of armor or the charge into battle, but in the steady rhythm of duty, debt, and devotion. It was a life lived under expectation, of honor, of obedience, of sacrifice, a life that demanded more than glory and gave less than peace. And so, if you find your thoughts wandering now, softly drifting between stone walls and damp fields, between candlelit chapels and distant tournament grounds, that's all right. Let them rest there a while. Let the dust settle over stirrups and scrolls. Let the night close gently over castles and commons. For you are here, far from the weight of iron and the burden of oaths. Here, where the stories are quiet, the truths are patient, and the past hums softly just beneath sleep. Once again, if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so we have more motivation to produce better quality products. And now, good night.